I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Hi, and welcome back to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and I am so glad you're here with us today because I have in my office, my studio here in Phoenix, Arizona, one of my great friends that we got to know each other 8-9 years ago. I had a chance to teach with this man at Arizona State University in the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership program. And I've been able to travel through Paris with him in his crazy car as he was driving us around. He asked me, where did we want to go? Michelle and I were over there with he and his wife, Jody, one day. He was driving his brother's car, and he said, what do you want to do? And it was rush hour. And I said, I want to see you negotiate the turnabouts at the Arc de Triomphe. And sure enough, he got into the middle of that thing, and it was like Mad Max, and it was so much fun. But the reason why I have him here for you today is because he is one of the most thoughtful, international traveling communicator, marketer, and a man who has really been behind the movement of sustainability in America and around the world, but in America. He is the head of sustainability at NRG, and he'll explain a little bit more about NRG, headquartered out of Princeton, New Jersey. Again, I met him when he was actually at Dell Computer as the director of social responsibility, and prior to that, he was with Dell as the director of in supply chain management. Before that, he was with Schwab as the director of e-business. His name is Bruno Sarda, and I count him among some of my best friends and top professionals, and he's here today to share with us how he is able to manage and what he has learned in finding the middle ground in a very, very contentious, polarized world we live in today, not just the left and the right, but around sustainability, global warming, environmental, social issues, and how does the head of sustainability for NRG walk that fine line of building commerce, building a company, and at the same time doing as little harm, having as little impact on the world negatively, and having an enormous impact on the world in a positive way. And that is not an easy tightrope to walk in this day and age. So he's with us today, and Bruno, I want to welcome you to the Business of Story. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Park. Love being here.
We met, 8 years ago here in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was a green conference going on, and I was handling a panel discussion, and it was sort of at the end of a long day, and as some of these conferences can be sometimes, can be a little bit dry. You have a lot of experts, a lot of smart people there. And so we decided to mix it up a little bit, had a panel discussion. And I remember throwing balls out in the audience and whatever. And after that, you came up and introduced yourself. And at that time, working in social responsibility and supply chain at Dell. And you introduced yourself, and there was just a connection we had, and we became fast friends after that. So I can't believe it's already been 8 years.
I know. I still feel as young as I did then, but I don't look as young, I think.
Well, you've traveled a little bit since then, and you've had a lot on your plate. Now, you're in town this week from your home out in Princeton, New Jersey, where you work with NRG, at ASU, Arizona State University. You just graduated out. What would this be, the 5th cohort for the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership?
Right.
Yeah, and then introduced the 6th cohort, which will kick off this week. tell us about the week. How's it going? And tell us a little bit about the EMSL program.
Yeah, it's one of my great privileges. I've now been, I've been in the corporate world now for, 25 plus years, but for the last, about 8 years or so, I've also had the opportunity to teach at Arizona State, which, has now been named 4 years in a row the number one university in innovation in the U.S., systematically beating, Stanford and MIT to the punch, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but now 4 times in a row. In the School of Sustainability, which was the first school of sustainability in the country, and frankly remains, I think, by a wide margin, the premier institution for sustainability education and leadership and research and kind of partnerships around not just, frankly, the U.S., but I think in the world. So it's a great privilege to be able to have that be part of my life. And this executive master's program we created many years ago, and now in the 6th year teaching this executive program, was really designed to take people where they were in their life. We've had students in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, wanting to come back to school to learn, how to bring about change that they saw was needed.
And these aren't just people hanging around their home looking for a job. These are executives from Bayer Pharmaceutical, Cummins, Diesel, and fairly new grads that I want to have an even bigger impact in the world.
Right. People from we've had people from working in cities and counties and for state government, federal agencies, certainly corporations, nonprofits, other academic institutions, social enterprises, people who were deep in a career 25 years into, architecture or something else, and saying, I want to go do something else. I see a need in my community and I need to be part of that. What I love about it is all of our students come from very different walks of life and stages in their life, but they have one thing in common is they see they show up at the stadium, and it's not to grab a Coke and go sit in the bleachers. It's to suit up and get on the field. And, there's a game to be played, and they want to be part of helping win it. And so that's a great, very rewarding part of my life, but it frankly is also very much aligned with how we have to approach sustainability in the business world, right? It can't be about, how we win at the expense of a lot of other things. It's about, how do you create value? How do you create opportunity? How do you unpack opportunity that is sometimes viewed as a threat? So that's, what we try to teach also is it's a very opportunity-based message. It's a very, positive narrative around, there's so much opportunity to be had in advancing a more sustainable and more regenerative, a more inclusive economy. Again, that it's not about, making people lose. It's really about, pitching a bigger tent.
And yet you find yourself in this world that we all find ourselves in now, very, very polarized. You have the far left, you have the far right. They both have very distinctive, powerful brands because everybody knows what those two factions stand for. And yet, when it comes to sustainability, you've got to find a middle ground for everybody where everybody wins somewhat in the process. And in doing so, it takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of storytelling. And how, Bruno, have you found in your world, leading the push at Dell and now out at NRG, you've been there about 2.5 years. That's what we're going to cover today is what have you found that works if you have two very factious groups that you're going against, but you're trying to sell probably the most important brand ever, and that is of how do we curtail climate change and our impact on this planet?
Yeah, it's an interesting interesting path to navigate. NRG, for those who may not be familiar, because we're not necessarily a household name everywhere in the country. We are the largest independent power company in the U.S. We're not a regulated utility, so many of your listeners might live in a community where they don't get to choose who they buy their power from. Their power just will come from whatever utility they might be assigned to because of
So
their
here in Arizona,
their zip
for
code.
instance.
Like, for example, if you live a certain place, it's going to be Arizona Public Service, it's going to be SRP, it's going to be Tucson Electric Power. You don't get to choose. About a dozen states or so in the country, you actually get to choose who you buy your power from, and about a couple dozen states, businesses get to choose, but as households, it's really a minority of Americans who get to choose. And, that's certainly one of our big stories that we try to tell as a company is, that's fundamentally un-American. Nobody, if we try to tell you, oh, because of your zip code, you have to buy your cell service from Verizon, or you have to buy your groceries at Safeway, or you have to, get your medicine at Walgreens. And we'd be like, well, no, I'm going to go where they offer me the best value, the best prices, the best selection, whatever. And so we bring that to the marketplace in terms of electricity and services, is that in all the states where competition is allowed, we compete.
What are some of those states?
So the biggest one is Texas. Texas is the only state in the nation where there's not an incumbent utility. So in Texas, they made the law that basically, except for a couple of pockets of towns where they still have some protected utilities, for the most part in Texas, it's kind of like anything else, right? You want electricity? Well, you have to choose a provider. You're not going to be given one by default. In all the other states like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois, Maryland, etc., New Jersey, where I live, you're going to be assigned your local utility, but you can choose an alternative. So that's what we do. In Texas, for example, we are by far the biggest. We own about 30% of the retail electricity market in Texas. In all other markets, we're much smaller because this kind of opt-out model is such that the incumbent utilities remain dominant, and in fact, very few people even in those states that we call choice states even know they have a choice. So we are a residential power retailer. We also serve large commercial or small and large commercial entities around the country. And we are also a power generator. So we own about 26,000 megawatts of generation, mostly in the Gulf states and in the Northeast.
What kind of generation is that?
So we have a little bit of everything. We still have we have coal, we have natural gas, we have some oil, as well as some solar and wind.
Mm-hmm. And you have your name on the Houston Texans Stadium. So
Yes.
if you're watching football and you see NRG Stadium, now you're hearing from their head of sustainability. So to that point, Bruno, of course, NRG is in the energy business to make money. How difficult is it to come in, from a sustainability hat, being the sustainability guy in there, and balance that, want and need to make a profit for your shareholders, but also have, a very positive impact in the communities you serve and the planet we all live on?
Yeah, sustainability is interesting, and one of the great motivations for me to move to NRG, as you mentioned, about 2.5 years ago, is it is so central now to the business strategy of the energy industry and the power sector. When I was at Dell, sustainability was absolutely important and valued, but the fact is, it wasn't the start and end of all kind of future success conversations. It was about, the invention of new technologies and et cetera. But in the energy industry these days, sustainability is so central to the strategy and the future that it's been a great opportunity for me to be much closer to, really, so how do we succeed? How do we define success? Not how do we define sustainable success? How do we define success through the lens of sustainability? And in fact, NRG's vision statement that was recrafted a little bit about 3 years ago now is NRG's vision is to create a sustainable energy future. That is truly why we exist. And so sustainability is in the title, if you will. And the reason that is that, there is no succeeding in this sector if you don't, take that approach. Anybody who chooses to reject sustainability today is just like those companies that rejected the internet or wireless. It's coming at you regardless of how you feel about it. And the opportunity, of course, is how do you choose to receive this change as opposed to whether you want to embrace this change. And I think, when we look at examples of other industries, maybe, when you see now, companies like Amazon and Apple and Google and Netflix being the largest media companies, it's because, those who were incumbents at the time were so protective of their business models that they, rather than embrace this new platform that was the internet and this clear signal from the marketplace that digital music or digital movies or digital everything was where the business wanted to go. Taxis didn't have to wait for Uber to do what Uber did, and yet they waited, and now, frankly, they've lost a lot of market share as a result. There's countless examples. So I think to NRG's credit, we've seen that for a while, that there is no path to a successful business future that does not embrace a more sustainable energy outcome. And sustainable doesn't just mean, renewable. It's about, sustainability. If you break the word down, it's, the ability to sustain. It's how do we continue succeeding as a sector that basically keeps the lights on very reliably, very affordably, very safely in this country. And we take a lot of pride in that. The U.S. power grid, sometimes called the greatest machine ever built, does that extremely well. And now it has a new variable to contend with, which is how to do all of that and reduce its environmental footprint, both carbon, maybe the water used, or some of the waste products created and returned to the environment. So that's what we have to do, is we have to achieve a new set of goals that you could define as sustainability while continuing to achieve an old set of goals, which is reliability, affordability, safety, and to some extent, resiliency, which is important, especially in the face of a changing climate, as has been evidenced in the last few months and years.
And one of your biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge, is to message and storytell around that, because I would imagine, and maybe in boardrooms, it's working, down in D.C. and whatever, politics, bringing two different factions together to find a common middle ground. How do you do that when that middle ground is so filled with nuance and it can be mushy and people can't necessarily, embrace it like they can the far left or the far right? Give us an example of maybe where story has worked for you, where you've been able to go in and change the narrative a little bit to get someone who was a non-believer to at least open their mind or open their heart to a potential new way of doing something.
Yeah, I mean, so in my role, I get to talk a lot to, whether it's our big commercial partners, I do talk a lot to policymakers, both at the federal level, quite a bit at the state level, regulators as well. And to your point, everybody comes to these conversations usually with a pretty firmly anchored point of view. And, our opportunity is to try to, if not change their mind, at least open their mind to the fact that their established beliefs are not necessarily the complete picture. And a good example, and I don't know that this would be a success story necessarily, but a good example would be California. California has been really at the forefront of advancing a low carbon economy. They decided early on that they were going to spend their way there. They weren't going to wait for the economics to make sense, whereas many other states have to. And to some extent probably should. But coal has long been gone from California, but now there's a big push to also do away with natural gas and to really accelerate the rise of renewables. And we're all for that. But, we've been trying
renewables, you're primarily talking about wind and solar?
Well, yeah, wind and solar, because, depending on who you talk to, hydroelectric power will be included in renewables. Some people like to lump nuclear in there as well, because even though it's not renewable by any means, it requires a fuel, in this case, uranium, but it is low carbon or carbon free, at least in terms of power generation. But, one of the things we talk about a lot is up until a time when we have a new suite of tools and technologies, including, very broad scale battery storage or other forms of storage, but, that can last for days or weeks, the best batteries that exist in the world today will last a few hours. And that's not good enough for the US power grid. And so part of what we talk about is natural gas is actually a great way to firm up the grid that is rapidly embracing renewables. It's actually a way to allow the renewable penetration to go faster because you have a good backstop. We've been building, for example, what we call fast start gas plants in California, and other parts, but including California, where these are plants you can turn on and they get to 100% capacity in less than 10 minutes. A typical kind of large conventional power plant that runs natural gas, it might take up to 2 days to go from, cold start to fully operational. And so fast start gas, you can turn on and off multiple times a day, when you need it. And that's exactly what you need to firm up the renewables on the grid and to allow you to be more aggressive in putting renewables on the grid. But that's a very hard conversation to have with people who have decided that natural gas is a non-starter and they'd rather not have that than have it, even though, it may actually cause them to go slower in what they really want, which is a low carbon grid. And so these are some examples of, so how do you tell that story? How do you bring those narratives of, how do you change the system in a way that actually makes sense? We at NRG, along with, our colleagues and other power companies, take very, very seriously the fact that when you flip that switch on, the light comes on. And, we take that so much for granted. But the fact is, if that wasn't as reliable today as it were, before, people would not be happy and our economy would suffer, our safety would suffer, our health would suffer. Again, so much of what we do every day relies on electricity. We'd like to say that where electricity flows, opportunity follows. And so the reliability of our electricity system is paramount. But that's one of those examples where it's hard to sometimes have a facts-based conversation, a rational conversation of where we absolutely want the same things, but there's a variable in the system that some parties will just be very, very polarized on, and we need to have a dialogue. And frankly, the more we can talk through these things, the more we get people to understand. Oh, wait, so you mean these fast start gas plants that run maybe less than 5% of the time actually have a very small carbon footprint because of that. They're highly efficient and they run very little, but when they run, they're really important and you really, really want them. It's kind of like having a spare tire, right? Or having a fire extinguisher in your kitchen, or having car insurance. Frankly, you hope you never need it, but when you need it, you want it to be there.
It's nice to have it there.
Yeah.
How do you open that conversation then, or how do you approach that when they're already said, no gas, we're trying to get away from it. Last thing we're going to do is invest in this particular thing. So when you've got that kind of mindset, what do you do to just pry that door open a little bit? And is it logic or is it emotion that works to get them to at least open their mind to a possibility?
I think when we can talk about this concept of reliability and actually make it real, so what happens when the electricity goes out? I mean, literally what happens? Hospitals maybe aren't able to run, or schools, or critical services to the community like law enforcement or fire department, communication systems or something. I mean, many of them have some kind of backup power system, but we all rely on power to, whether it's to charge our wireless devices, whether it's to, again, to have lights on, especially after hours. And so when you can describe a place and a time when electricity is not there reliably, and specifically to politicians, get them to envision, what do you think your constituents would say if you told them, well, your electricity is not as reliable as it was before, but it's way cleaner. That would not be an easy conversation for them to have. And we give them a better alternative where it's almost as clean. I mean, 98, 99% just as clean, but there's a backstop there that makes a whole lot of sense. And you can use metaphors, you can use analogies. I mean, one of the ones I talk about are national security apparatus, right? I mean, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year as a country on things that we hope we don't need, but we believe they're necessary. And, we believe some of these kind of power plants I just described, when people say, oh, they're wasteful, it's money we shouldn't spend because we may not want to use them that much. And it's like, yeah, like many other things in our life, right? Like we put $1,000 airbags in our cars that we hope never have to inflate, right? I mean, we do that all the time. And so just trying to bring this it's
sort
like,
of everyday analogies that they can relate to.
Again, we can all relate to these things. Like nobody wants to go spend $100 billion or whatever on a fleet of aircraft carriers, but at the same time we like what they do for us, and we like that they're there if we should ever need them.
You said something I really is interesting and provoking, and I think it's something that we just overlook, but it is so powerful. You said, share with them a time and a place when something happened that they can relate to, that they may or may not want to have happen to them, a time and a place. So what you're talking about is positioning your story with an event versus logics, facts, stats, that sort of thing, which I'm sure you've seen whenever you roll out a bunch of facts to try to defend a position, they just cross their arms and they argue it and they try to, dispel your facts, get rid of them. But when you can point to an actual event and use that metaphor that they can absolutely relate to, they're like, oh yeah, you're right. I don't want that to happen, or I do want that to happen. It's much more powerful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it sure is. And we've all been there to some extent, but especially anybody who's lived in either in the Southeast or in or the Northeast, or even, in California recently with the wildfires and people feeling very, very vulnerable because of natural events. And you ask them, have you ever been without power for more than a few hours or even for several days? And what was that like? You feel incredibly vulnerable so fast because, maybe it's very hot or it's very cold and you literally feel full fear for your safety or that of your family. If you don't have electricity to recharge your phone these days, you may literally feel cut off from the world. You don't have internet access anymore because your router and your modem runs on electricity and you feel completely disconnected. And we don't have the old, AM radios sitting around running on a couple of AA's anymore. And so, getting people to really remember what it felt like to be without power, even for a few hours. And everybody understands that. And then, if it's more than a few hours, all the food in your fridge and your freezer is going to go bad. And, some even fearmongers in the energy sector will say, and grandma's going to die on the operating table because the hospital is going to run out of, and there's lots of consequences if the power, and one of the key differentiators between what we would call the first world and the third world is actually the reliability of the electricity sector. So it is truly a leading indicator of economic success and prosperity.
Well, and you say that, I was just thinking about my recent, as in yesterday and this morning, battle with my internet. I have CenturyLink here, and it's been working fine. They put a new modem in 6 weeks ago, and it's been great. Well, I got into the office after a story workshop yesterday, and it was up, it was down, it was on, it was off, and I was talking to some of the other folks around here. I said, has this been going on all day? And they go, yeah. It pops in, and then it'll be on for 5 minutes and pops off. Well, we had power, but we didn't have this basic necessity of internet connection. So I missed a FaceTime or a Skype session with a potential new client. I missed another Zoom session with a current client that I needed to follow up with because I had no internet access. So even as you were just talking about that on a very large scale, we take it so for granted that we've got this power here. But here, and they finally, thank God, showed up at 11:15 this morning, and the guy got it fixed, and now it's working better than ever. A real first world problem, but it completely impacted my business.
That reminds me. Years ago, early in my sustainability career, I got to see a public speaker, Jim Wolseley, who was head of the CIA under Bill Clinton, and who, after his time in the Clinton administration, became a fierce advocate for new energy systems. And he used to say, in his time at the CIA, they looked and I think there were something like 18 critical infrastructures in the U.S., things like water treatment, air traffic control, you name it. But all of the 18 were predicated on the success of one, which was the U.S. power grid. And for example, in many states, including Arizona, about 40% of the electricity is used to move water and to process to clean water. So in Arizona, if electricity goes out, you run out of water relatively quickly because pumps start running, and so there's again, not to belabor the point, but there's something so fundamentally embedded in all of the systems we rely on every day for our, not just our comfort and our safety and our livelihoods, but truly our economic success and prosperity, and our ability to do everything else we do, that, again, we have to be thoughtful about it. But to your earlier point, these are very nuanced solutions in terms of how do we get to that? How do we get to a place where we decarbonize all these systems in a way that is thoughtful and rational and economically sound and doesn't, either bankrupt the system or jeopardize the stability of the system? Because frankly, none of us really want that. Some people will advocate for, let's go 100% like tomorrow, but the fact is they're not the ones having to sign that check either. And so, that is part of the job, is to have that conversation and ultimately, whether it's with our investors, our regulators, our employees, our customers, having a thoughtful approach to this. So, and I think the more we get to have those dialogues and bring those examples, I think I have yet to find somebody who will remain deeply entrenched in their views. The problem is we don't get to have conversations with everybody, and sometimes you have to rely on messaging, you have to rely on branding, you have to rely on advertising or whatever to try to summarize your message in a much more concise way, which sometimes leaves out some of the details.
Well, you've got your degree in marketing, and you came up through that and did a lot of sales marketing at Schwab. You also got then your master's in applied ethics and in science and technology. Is that right? Applied ethics and science and technology, which is pretty fascinating. That's about just the impact, the pros and cons of it in our society. And what I know of you and have seen you in action over the years is you have always brought a very thoughtful and rational approach around storytelling and messaging and sustainability. But I know it doesn't always go well. Can you take us to a time recently where you have been, or the organization has been, trying to bring a thoughtful, rational, I don't want to say argument, but position using story that blew up on you, that didn't work, and what'd you do?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the example I'll use is one where maybe we didn't bring story and maybe should have. So, back in mid 2017, NRG announced a pretty fundamental strategy, that we call the transformation plan, but outlined a set of strategy moves that the company was going to make and why. And, it was really a set of arguments oriented very much at an investor community that was very, again, kind of well thought out and very rational. But one of the parts of this business transformation was the divestment of NRG's renewables development division. So at the time, NRG was top 5 in the nation for both new solar development and new wind development. And
you were actually building solar and wind farms?
Yeah, we were originating projects. We were building and operating both solar and wind projects around the country. And, when we announced that part of our transformation plan was to divest this division, again, we made all the financial arguments as to why that made sense. But immediately, a lot of our constituencies reacted in believing that this was really a signal that we were abandoning our sustainability strategy and turning our back on this sustainable energy future we had been talking about, and really double,
And this is a brand position you guys had created. And
sure.
So they're like, oh, here's another energy company just turning their back on us.
Right. And, the reality is we are absolutely still in the renewables business. The decision makes a lot of business sense because those large-scale renewable energy projects, which was really what our renewables development organization was doing, large-scale, most like what we call utility-scale renewables project. They're projects that even before you break ground, you've already sold the power for the next 20, 25 years, usually to a utility or some other large off-takers. And so, the main economics of a utility scale renewable energy project is, since there's relatively little labor involved in operating a solar farm or a wind farm, once it's been built, it's going to produce power for the next 20 or 25 years with no fuel cost, relatively low labor cost. And so really it's your cost of capital. And company like ours, retail electricity company, power generator, exposed to commodity price volatility, et cetera, our cost of capital is much higher than maybe some other type of business entity. And so it made basically that business was being under-optimized and underutilized because it was tied to a capital structure that NRG had that was not optimal to be a developer of renewable energy projects. So we decided actually we could monetize that business, sell it for much more than we could retain and operate it for. And so that made a lot of sense. Having said that, we have now since then announced actually all kinds of other ventures we're doing, and we're innovating in how we're bringing renewables to the market, not being the builder and developer, but really being the aggregator and ultimately seller of those projects and
so
provider.
Other people are building them, but
Right.
you guys are then opening up the funnel to get it into the marketplace.
Exactly. And so for us it made sense always, but we did not do a good job of telling that story up front. We did not do a good job of helping people understand how committed we were still to actually advancing the renewable energy space and how much we wanted to participate in it and how we could actually, to some extent, even innovate more, because we were no longer tied to one renewable developer, but rather had access to a variety of solutions in the marketplace where we could get to market faster, cheaper, and more flexibly for our customers. And so I think we're starting to turn that corner now. But it took us a while. And certainly as the head of sustainability, I had to answer that question dozens of times from customers, from investors, from nonprofits who were like, so why did you guys abandon renewables? And it's like, whoa, that is so not what happened. But yet I could totally understand why they would believe that.
And in hindsight, you might handle it differently. You
Sure.
just come right out and say, here's what our real story
And even
is.
from our employees, many of our employees felt very strongly about the fact that they liked that NRG was a big player in the renewable space and believed that by our divesting this part of the business, we were, again, kind of leaving that part of the business. And that, again, that couldn't be farther from the truth. I think in hindsight, we would have been more proactive in recognizing that that's what would be interpreted and devise a different way to message around that so that we could be more transparent and thoughtful about how to assuage those concerns and those perceptions. Because as you know, if you leave a story vacuum, something's going to fill it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't wait for you to fill it. Either people's minds will fill it, or somebody else will fill it for you.
And people are hungry for that narrative, so
Sure.
they'll buy into whatever you tell them
Sure.
at that point. And then you, as the brand or the defender now of your good name, have to come up with a better story, a truthful, better, more powerful story. And I would imagine now in hindsight, leadership looks back and like, oh, we didn't anticipate that. They were paying more attention maybe than we thought they would, or what? We just didn't think it was that big of a deal. I mean, not just NRG, but when you see this happen with other brands, and maybe it happened to Dell when you were there, I'm not sure. Is it just because the brand, it isn't like twisting its black, mustache trying to get people? They're just maybe not paying attention or didn't anticipate what would happen? Or how do you avoid that?
I think, it's interesting when you see some of those big, let's call them flops, in the market. And many of us will sit there scratching our heads, say, what were they thinking? And yet it's not like they weren't. One example at Dell, which was I was reminded of recently, it's a pretty traumatic event, but, Dell realized in its consumer business that it was very, very male oriented in how it was communicating about its products, its offering, its value proposition, and realized that there was not only a gap in terms of better communicating with women, but actually a need. I mean, as technology was, becoming more and more pervasive, it wasn't just for people who had to work with technology. I mean, as you know, we all use technology every day. We have wireless devices, we have laptops, we have tablets, we have all these things. And so Dell realized we need to do better and got a whole group of really smart people, mostly women, to gather around, did a bunch of market research, did a bunch of brand development around, how can we make our brand more friendly to women who aren't interested in learning a whole lot about technology, but who still want access to technology on their terms and present it to them in ways that will relate to their needs. And Dell even went so far as to actually create a sub-brand called Della, and actually had a very big celebrity name lined up to do celebrity endorsement and all of that, and launched, and they had done everything right. Absolutely everything right.
And their heart was in the right place.
Except they did everything right with blinders on, in the sense that what they were really addressing was not women. It was a certain type of women, especially in this case, I think you would call, suburban women or kind of, soccer moms, etc. But this idea of women who were not professionally involved with technology every day and who felt like still they needed to better understand and become better users of technology. But because Dell missed that point in their whole narrative around this, they launched and saying, look, we have this new offering for women who are creatures who don't understand technology. And needless to say, instant backlash from the hordes of amazingly skilled, amazingly competent, amazingly accomplished women CIOs, women network administrators, women IT tech support people, and, tens of thousands of women whose profession is IT and technology,
and who is buying Dell products,
and who felt, who were large Dell customers, who were amazingly offended, rightly so, by the fact that this whole campaign had been painted as all women need to be kind of sold technology in a way that looks more like we're selling handbags, as opposed to, presenting it in a better light. So I think, for me, the moral of the story was they did everything right. They were serving a segment that was truly underserved and that truly felt angst at, I need technology in my life, and the way it's being sold to me, whether I go to Best Buy, whether I go to Fry's Electronics, whether I go to Dell.com, it's intimidating, it's off-putting, it's just, paralyzing. And so there was a massive subsegment that needed this new approach and this new, if you will, voice from the sector. But again, a huge miss because, we had those blinders on. And I think, there's so many parallels these days of, we get so caught up in trying to speak to a particular constituency that we start assuming that everybody who kind of looks like that will respond the same way. And that's just not true.
It sounds like that's where mansplaining came from, is your Dell campaign right there, man. But yeah, their hearts were in the right place. They just weren't seeing the big picture necessarily, or they certainly saw it within 24 hours of launching that campaign.
Yeah, it was about that long.
So last part of this interview, I want to cover quickly with you, Bruno. You are at the epicenter, at the crosshairs of sustainability, and your job, and you take it very seriously, is to get out and get people on the left side of the aisle and the right side of the aisle to embrace this. And one thing that I learned working with you, as I taught at EMSL for a number of years, and the thing when you were at Dell and you brought to me and my thought about sustainability and sustainable storytelling, is that sustainability is not about doing without. It's about doing it differently, and you can still live in a land of abundance and make a lot of money and have everything you want.
Sure.
But it's about doing it differently. And you said it's about sustainability done right actually increases revenue, it reduces risk, and it enhances the brand.
Mm-hmm.
How have you had success or not in the last 2.5 years of trying to bring that message to America and the government and whatever, especially when we have such polarized Washington, D.C., and we've got, a climate denier sitting in the White House? How has it been working for you? What's working and what's not working?
Yeah, great question. I mean, as you point out, a lot of how I've been successful in my role is by systematically trying to depoliticize the conversation. I come at it systematically from a place of value creation, a place of, again, a business mindset, right? This is worth doing. I don't care how you think about it, and just, the short story of how I got into sustainability. You mentioned I worked at Schwab for almost 10 years and then at Dell for 11 years total, but only about half that time was in sustainability and social responsibility. But my first really 15 plus years of my career was riding that kind of crazy wave of the internet, right? From the mid 90s to about 2010, the internet was this powerful, massive, hugely disruptive force that plowed everything in its path. I mean, nothing was left untouched or unchanged. And it really didn't matter how you felt about it. It just was. It was coming at you. And, we used the example earlier, if you were in the music and movie business and you were so caught up in trying to sue people that were trying to do a different business model, or you were trying to protect your rights while other business models were being built around you. And for me, that was really my path to sustainability, is realizing that what we call sustainability today is a lot like the internet. It's this thing, it's happening, it's big, it's massively disruptive, it's going to change everything about what, when you look at all the systems we've built as a society over the last decades and centuries, our food systems, our transportation systems, our energy systems, our built environments, our cities, we have built them in ways that did not necessarily account for the fact that there was at some point we were run out of something, and just like we all know as, citizens and people and individuals, I can't spend more money than I make forever. That has to end, right? I think we can all inherently understand you can't fish out of the sea faster than they can reproduce forever. At some point that ends. You can't cut trees faster than they grow forever. At some point you run out, right? So this idea of, sustainability is really, how do we create systems that can run in perpetuity, or at least much longer than the current systems we have? And so when I bring that conversation to the audiences that I interact with, it's really about this notion of transformation is coming, regardless of how we feel about it. Our opportunity is to look at, how do we turn those risks and those headwinds and those changes and those disruptions into something we can gain from? And, ultimately, in a space where your entire industry is disrupted, those who react to it the best will have advantage from it and can create differentiation. Again, regulators or legislators that, maybe in public will say one thing, you get them in a closed room and they get it. And they're concerned about their constituents' jobs and the livelihoods of the communities that maybe have relied on a certain form of energy production or a certain type of manufacturing. And they're good people. They care about the people they represent. Again, publicly, they'll say something that ties to a particular political narrative. But in a closed room, they're much more open to what are the solutions and where are those next jobs coming from. They know the old economy jobs are a finite resource, and they're declining rapidly. So I think being tied to a positive message, a positive narrative of opportunity, of success, of possibilities, I found resonates with everybody, and that's what we try to do at NRG. We try to bring these notions of competition, as I mentioned earlier in the program, right? We are 100% competitive energy provider. We believe every American citizen, household, business should be able to choose who they buy their power from. If they had that choice, we believe everybody would be made to provide better services, better options, lower prices, more low carbon choices, etc. We try to bring that message to anybody who'll listen. We find that that's one that tends to cross the aisle. Most Americans believe in both the right of choice as citizens. We believe nobody should tell us who we have to buy what from. Power is actually a very weird exception still in many parts of the country. This spirit of competition and innovation that usually flows from competition. If you look at industries that have been deregulated, from telecom to airlines or banking, the set of choices we have, the opportunities we've had, whether it's, Google or Southwest Airlines or, that grew out of deregulation, even wireless and GPS and geolocation, and whether it's, Uber or Yelp or all those things that grew out of, fighting for our business and allowing new innovators to come and compete. We believe, those are all positive values that very few people in this country will reject as intrinsically good. So that's part of our story is trying to really get to a place where the collective voices and the collective wisdom of the invisible crowd, if you will lead us to a new paradigm that we hope we can be successful in, and that we're certainly gearing up for.
Yeah. In the next 5-6 years, by 2025, given your position you've seen it through high tech, you've seen it through sales, you now are in the energy business, and you certainly have seen it through academia, and you teach. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, put the Bruno Sarda mystic hat on. Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse as it relates to sustainability, global warming, in our progress in that direction between now and 2025, say? And then here's the real pressure seat question. What can you do about it in your position where you have a pretty powerful, megaphone as a head of sustainability at NRG, one of the top energy companies in the country?
I'm a fundamental optimist, and I have to say, it's very easy to get discouraged when we listen to politicians these days of any sort, because their job is to divide to some extent. It seems most of them have been now kind of caught in this cycle of trying to carve out constituencies in one part of the spectrum. But when you spend less time there and more time where I tend to spend most of my days, which is in industry, in corporate America, in communities, when you look at what cities are doing, there's amazing things happening in cities. You now have over 100 cities in the country that have committed to 100% clean energy by not like 2050, but sometimes 2025, 2020, 2030. And these aren't just like San Francisco. And, these are cities like Atlanta, like Orlando, like Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland, like Kansas City, Georgetown, Texas, San Antonio, Texas. I mean, these are, again, across the political spectrum. You see what the corporate sector is doing in food and transportation and energy and materials and manufacturing. It's all happening and it's all coming at us. And it's still relatively invisible to many people, but there's really positive transformations happening, again, because the business community, more than anything, recognizes that not doing this would be very detrimental to business. Embracing innovation, embracing disruption has been at the heart of economic prosperity and, frankly, American success in the world for decades. We have been those willing to pioneer and lead the way and kind of be that beacon of new systems. And so I do believe, by 2025 or so, we will have made great strides. It's not going to come without some pain. Again, there's going to be transitions that, transitions tend to happen faster and faster. And, the internet, as I mentioned earlier, flattened entire sectors. I mean, who knows a travel agent these days or a typesetter or, people like entire professions were obliterated in relatively short amount of time. We've seen the wireless industry and again, I mentioned Uber and Lyft earlier, the old ways of being a taxi driver in a very kind of protected class in many countries. Those things are going fast. And again, we all benefit as consumers, but certainly people who were incumbents will suffer some transition risk there. I think the energy system, there's no going back. I mean, there's not going to be a single new coal plant built in this country, and frankly, it won't be long before that answer is almost anywhere else. Not just because anybody doesn't like coal, is because, again, if you're going to spend money building a new power plant these days, that is the last place you want to put your money. You want to build, as I mentioned, a fast start gas plant, a wind farm, a solar farm, a battery storage facility. That's where, from a bang for your buck, that's where the value is going to be. And that's where the flexibility is. All this digitization of the grid that comes with the Internet of Things and AI and automation, all of that is combining. All these trends are coalescing into the energy system, so that truly one of the last big parts of our economy to be digitized is the power grid. But with it comes, again, a great amount of flexibility and opportunity. And for us in the power sector, we welcome all of that. We see the rapid electrification of things like transportation and other parts of the economy. Today, electricity is only about 22% of the energy mix in this country. It's estimated it could be up to 50% by 2050. And so, if you sell power for a living, you like that.
That's a pretty good deal. Well, Bruno, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're busy. And one of the ways I know you are going to have an impact by 2025 is you are arming professionals out of the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership and teaching them the nuances and the storytelling and what it takes to make a real impact inside and outside of major organizations and communities. And for that, I thank you. I know it's a lot of work. You come clear across the country to do it. And I know many of your graduates, and they are honored to have you as a professor. So thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Business of Story.
Well, thanks for having me, Park.
And thank you all for listening to this edition. If you've got a family member, friend, colleague, whatever, maybe they are a naysayer, maybe they don't believe in global warming, maybe they do, and they're having a hard time communicating their story, or if you know someone who's in a divisive industry and they're trying to help two completely polarized groups find common ground so that they can actually move together forward for the good of all, then share this episode with them and Bruno's wisdom. It's just fantastic, and it's the way we're all going to be able to make an impact in the families and our lives around us. So thank you for listening. And of course, if I can be of service to you in helping you with your story, to clarify your story, amplify your impact, and simplify your life, visit me at businessofstory.com. And until next week, when we have another amazing story artist on like Bruno, please remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.